minority rights, and democracy. So you'll be seeing some more of her as well in a bit. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring it and passing along the questions as we see them. You won't be able to unmute yourself or come onto the screen in this Zoom webinar format, but if you send us your questions, we will see them. You'll notice that this talk is being recorded, and we will post this on the Gender and Politics Lab website, www.genderandpoliticslab.com. Slow down for the interpretation, I'm going too fast, for you to check in with later if you like. So now the moment we've all been waiting for, our guest speaker. I am so very excited to introduce you to Dr. Marie Baptiste. Dr. Baptiste is Onu, a member of the Potlodik First Nation in Unama'ki, and a member of the Aroostook Band of the Mi'kmaq in Maine. After 28 years of teaching at the University of Saskatchewan, she retired to begin service in her home territory as special advisor to the Vice President Academic, Provost, and to the Dean of Unama'ki College on Decolonizing the Academy at Cape Breton University. A graduate of Harvard and Stanford universities, her research and scholarly work in decolonizing education, cognitive justice, and protecting Indigenous knowledges have earned her 5 honorary doctorate degrees, an appointment as Officer to the Order of Canada, and an elected fellow in the Royal Society of Canada. Dr. Baptiste is a widely published author of journals, chapters, and books, and those publications will appear at the end of the presentation for you to see and look up later. Thank you, Dr. Baptiste, for joining us today. We are so thrilled to have you here.
And I'm going to just upload my share screen to get you the slides, and hopefully we'll have that hold to shift to select multiple windows. No, that's the one I want. I don't know why. Okay, let's see if it flies over. It looks like it did, I think. And let's start with our first slide. Well, first of all, let me just begin by honoring and recognizing the land on which we are located. And I also am within the greater Mi'kmaq district, the 7 districts of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Newfoundland, we call Damkuk, and it is on this land that the conference has gathered on these ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples, of which there are many, the Mi'kmaq, who hold this land as part of their ancestral 7 districts of Mi'kmaq. The Beothuk, our up the river allies, we call them, whose history and voice has been silenced. The Innu and the Inuit, who hold special relationships with the water, the fish, and the animals of the north that stretches to many lands and realms. I want to begin by also honoring my ancestors, my parents, my peoples, and in Mi'kmaq, we say Dan Wedebeksi. Dan Wedebeksi is where I come from, and it's important for us to all honor the place from which we come. I come from the strong nation of Mi'kmaq people who have lived in, my parents have lived in Unama'ki, as well as I grew up in Maine. And as a result of that long-standing relationship in Maine, I am also a member of the Mi'kmaq Band of Aroostook. And that also gives me the dual citizenship that I hold in with Canada and the United States. Of my family is Sygage Henderson, with whom I write, and also our grandson is my son, who is the MP of the Member of Parliament for Sydney Victoria riding, and he is his son Jacoby, and our daughters are Mariah and Annie, both very accomplished Indigenous women. I start off also with recognizing that my sister attended the Indian residential school at Shubenacadie School. And it came at a time during our family's life when the government of Canada decided to remove our Mi'kmaq people from their self-sustaining homelands and moved them onto centralized reserves. My family was moved then to Eskasoni for a brief short of time, where it was increasingly difficult for my mother and father to live on the very small income and the growing family that they had. And so they went to the state of Maine to work in the fields as migrant laborers, and ended up staying there for the good of over 20 years before they returned to Bodladek First Nation. My sister spent a number of years at the Indian Residential School and suffered immensely from that. And it has been the backdrop of our life. It's been a backdrop of some of the trauma that we've experienced as a family. But it also is an important part of why I do what I do and the work that I'm involved in. As part of my own growing up, I came to recognize that we were more than just Mi'kmaq people in one place. But yet I recognized that as I went through school, that Indigenous people, whether you are in Canada or the United States or coming from New Zealand or any other country, that Indigenous people shared a great deal of experiences together, that Indigenous knowledges was probably one of the things that binded us as a people, as we were place-based cultures with very distinctive languages, distinctive worldviews, that we had strong Indigenous spiritual foundations, a strong relationship with our land and our place and nature. And in all of the settler colonialism that we lived with, we also had a depth of resilience that was ever present in our lives in terms of how we lived in the flux, and also with a great deal of the of settler colonialism. In that particular experience, as I went up through school, I realized that settler colonialism was something that was not just regional and affecting my people, but it was something that affected everyone, everywhere, and everyone had either been a benefit from it or one who had been harmed by it. So colonization and marginalization and powerlessness, exploitation, racism, violence, and cultural imperialism were all elements of what has been the experience of Indigenous people worldwide. What I have called, and what has been called, Eurocentrism, in my own studies, I've come to recognize that we have all been marinated in Eurocentrism, whether it's our parents or grandparents or all of us. And that experience of being marinated in Eurocentrism presents us with a cognitive frame, a socialization in society that has put us either at an advantage or a disadvantage. In the work of James Blount, I found this word Eurocentrism that has been something that I've come to understand as a European center characterized by superiority and progress, creating a hegemony of peoples and systems, hierarchies, and a monopoly that was over all other knowledge systems. It was characterized as a singularity that moved out from the center around to the periphery. And it was the center that saw themselves as superior civilizations and superior in its laws, and everything that they did was progress. And it was moved then out to the periphery, whether it was in Africa or India or South America or in all other countries of the world. And it moved in notions that it held a universal value of good, and it then diffused out to the periphery, and it became the engine of what I call cognitive imperialism, by which whole nations and groups of people have been denied their knowledge systems, their culture, spiritual identities, their land, and their wealth confiscated. Cognitive imperialism was something that, while I was in a class by Martin Carnoy at Stanford University, I took this course, and it was on cultural imperialism. And it was in that course that I recognized that the very imperialism that was coming from this center, British center, was mobilizing around the world in all its forms. And it then became the way in which success and progress was defined. So for Indigenous people, and many others as well, success was recognized as integration and assimilation to colonial British Eurocentric values and norms and languages, to their knowledges, and to assign as a measurement of value to all of us. It normalized multiple oppressions that were race, class, and gendered, and evident in the discourses, in the laws, in the policies, and all ongoing actions thereafter. It is from those particular elements of these multiple oppressions that in the 70s, 60s, and 70s that we began to identify the disparities that had happened as a result of that ongoing colonialism, and begin to recognize how they had affected women, how they affected Blacks, Indigenous people, and other minorities and diverse groups around the globe. But is so also in that we began to realize how all of the other elements that went with it, the bodies, the collective identities, the treaty rights that all had been ignored, the multicultures, the diverse languages, and how the privileging of certain values and languages had created these diverse oppressions that continue throughout the globe. And so it was in that building block, which was the foundation of one of the Canadian genocidal acts of the Indigenous people, the Indigenous Indian residential schools, of which there are over 100 of them located around Canada, to which all of our children were required to attend. Were forced out of their homes and families to attend these schools, where they treated them badly and created a cognitive imperialism that has resided with us, and from which we are recovering today. Over 150,000 children in over 100 schools attended these schools, from which they lost their languages and their knowledges, the skills connected to their land, their connections to their family and extended families, to their community, their culture, their spirituality, to their entirety of their Indigenous humanity, sciences, and knowledges. And it created, during the years that I was growing up as a young woman, and going back to the reserve, to as was my parents, whenever anybody died, we always went back to the funerals and attended. And from where I sat, I began to see the kind of despair that the Indigenous or the Indian residential schools had created in our communities, and those who left the schools, and the nihilism or meaninglessness it created in them when they when they had lost their Indigenous languages, or had had those eroded, when they were trying to struggle with whose values were important to raise their children in, and the kind of punitiveness of violence that they had learned in the reserve system was something that I thought was an important element for me to learn from, as well as to begin to think about the effects those had on us. In the Royal Commission report of 1996, the report cautioned that ethnocentric and demeaning attitudes lingered in the policies of the past, but they also linger in policies that purport to work on behalf of Aboriginal people while actually withholding from them the power to work out their own destiny. And we saw that in the Indian Act. And so, although no longer formally acknowledged, this doesn't lessen their contemporary influence and their capacity to generate modern variants. And that is a very thing that I'm talking about today, is that educational institutions generally create ideas and concepts and practices that they think are in the good of our people, but they do not lessen the contemporary influence of superiority that resides in them. And in them, we find there are, in the settler relations and narratives, the university disciplinary traditions, our Eurocentric knowledge systems that continue to be privileged to achieve dominance and obscuring what was erased and marginalizing and hiding racism and colonialism. It also was the ways in which our languages and knowledges had been viewed as having no contemporary significance, not just only for Indigenous people, but for others as well, and having very little value for education in universities. The students, our Indigenous students, are recruited as a body, but then they're so Eurocentric education and academy, and there is very little for them to grow into their Indigenous knowledges, and it's built on a notion of their developing individual capacity and self-development so they can do the hard work of correcting colonialism and Eurocentrism in our communities, as well as affecting and carrying the biggest burden of all of trying to change or transform educational institutions from their colonial origins. So Aboriginal students, faculty, and staff are living with the dissonance and split brain consciousness that Gregory Kahete called bingahe, the kind of thing in which you are having to carry the whole violence of colonialism while you are trying to navigate an education in a school system. One of the things that I've come to learn of more recently is this term called agnology or agnotology, written in a book by the Macon, by Proctor and Scheibinger in 2008. It's defined as the cultural production of ignorance, or how ignorance is produced through neglect, secrecy, suppression, destruction of documents, unquestioned tradition, and social political selectivity. Agnology or agnotology probably is more evident today as we begin to see in some political countries, especially in the United States, where they ignore, define, and redefine various things like civilization, like truth-telling, and so on. And that is a whole building block of which all these countries have been born into and grew into, but that has not been totally evident. And then now we are beginning to see agnology reappearing as an important element for change in political ideologies. So what I'm trying to say is that, decolonization is something that we all are having to address, that each one of us is either been a victim or a beneficiary of the same educational system, and few of us are privileged with a knowledge of how to achieve a decolonized education. And there is no silver, if I might say, call it bullet, or, individual kind of approach that's going to change it all. It's going to be a massive undertaking for us to be able to understand it, and then to work in our own locations as well as in our professions, and dealing with institutions at their disciplinary level. The the good part of where things have gone, and it's is that, since I would say the late 70s, when the various movements of civil rights and American A movement, the indigenous rights movements, women's rights movements, and so on. All of these have come about as a result of all of the awareness building that these movements have mobilized in books and being on frontline activist events. So as a result of this, Indigenous Renaissance began probably in the late 60s and on, has been a emerging, growing event with Indigenous elders and scholars and researchers and activists leading this discourse of respect and decolonization in research, education, law. It's been part of the Constitution of Canada, courts, and legislation. Also, we've had this great non-Indigenous ally grouping that has come through post-colonial scholarship, through and gender and women and gendered studies and so on. And these allies are developing and have been developing scholarship and theories and alternative approaches to Eurocentrism, colonialism, racism, and oppression, to which we have critical race theory, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-oppressive theories and practices that are important to the place where we are today. In Canada as well, we've gone through a period of decolonization. Internationally, the international decolonization began following World War Wars with the remedy of the orientation of empire as singular and all-powerful, needing to be decolonized. And that came about a recognition of colonial dispossession, enslavement, and subjugation. And so the human rights laws had moved from international law to decolonization as liberation from colonialism. And that began with first creating the human rights, the individual rights, as fundamental to all humans of all nations. And then secondly, the way in which to achieve that decolonization was through self-determination of those particular peoples in the places where colonization occurred. So decolonization in Canada, it came about with the Canada Act of 1982 that creates a constitutional fiduciary obligations on Canada and its governments to affirm Aboriginal and treaty rights. It also created the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for designated groups respecting the human dignity of all individuals. But even in the Canada Act, it was that Aboriginal rights could not be trampled on by individual rights, and that is in Section 52 of the Constitution Act, which is the Canada Act. So Canada then further in 2007 affirmed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. That was probably a 25, 30-year journey of Indigenous people creating that declaration. And that was finally signed by all the countries, including the four that initially rejected it, including Canada. But in 2007, they approved it and then passed the UNDRIP Act in 2021. And that act will align all laws with UNDRIP. There's many other activators that have gone along with or have been part of that journey of decolonization, the Royal Commission report, the TRC calls to action. Universities Canada has come on as a 2016 or 2015. And then the Tri-Council Policy on Indigenous Research, which was revised in 2018. So what we have is that, the UN Declaration has said that all people have all the rights of human rights, these fundamental rights, as well as they are free and clear of in being able to exercise their own collective identities, as well as free and equal to all other peoples. They have a right to self-determination and more. But why decolonization and not just Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion has been a report that we did with the Congress in 2021, and there have been decades of unsatisfactory results of EDI, skepticism of the results of EDI committees and what's changed and why we're still having EDI committees, and that Indigenous people have not seen themselves as EDI seeking, although they are EDI deserving. In other words, Indigenous peoples have seen that their treaty and Aboriginal rights have not been considered in most of the equity, diversity, inclusion concerns, and these things continue to do ongoing harm to Indigenous people. Equality and equity are about fairness and human rights, and that diversity has been about acceptance and belonging. But largely, equity, diversity, and inclusion have been about inclusion in the Eurocentric framework, and that it is how do we all work within this one framework as opposed to the balancing of diverse frameworks, which is why decolonization is a structure and a needed element that helps us to unpack the colonial privileging of certain knowledges and traditions, while also recognizing that the reconstruction of Indigenous nations and other people's identities and knowledge systems need to be the foundation for the recovery of those and the rebuilding and recentering them as in the education and all the social systems laws that are currently operating. So when we think about decolonization and indigenization and reconciliation, we're looking at these three different elements of them. And I had Lorna Andrews, who does a lovely video online. You should check her video out. But she offered this framework, and which I have adapted here to illustrate the ways in which indigenization must be led by Indigenous people. And it is also a shared responsibility. But reconciliation is a settler responsibility that benefits everyone, as well as a shared responsibility. And decolonization then becomes the building blocks of both the reconciliation and indigenization with benefits large. So reconciliation, if we look at the TRC calls to action, is a requirement for an awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm, and atonement that causes an action to change behavior. It's the head, heart, hand kind of thing that we think about, the head being the way we understand things, the heart being how we process that into our heart to effectively change how and what we do in the future. And so it really needs to continue to address the losses and also the historical barriers and redress the economies and growth and change in Indigenous communities, and that as a result, we will then be able to begin to rebuild an indigenization in the institutions that work to understanding that we need to respect Indigenous wisdom and knowledge and expertise in constructing and co-constructing the laws and policies and practices, programs, degrees, economies, environments, institutions, and societies. And it requires Indigenous people to take the lead in this as they move forward with various program changes in institutions. When we look at decolonization, as reported in the Congress report that I show here, and that you can find online, decolonization is a necessary and ongoing process of unlearning, uncovering, and transforming the legacies of colonialism, as well as utilizing the educational knowledge systems available to relearn, rebuild the social, cultural, linguistic foundations that were lost or eroded through colonialism. And then in so doing, it requires us making space, balancing, generating, and enabling diverse knowledges to thrive in the academy, as well as in and through educational knowledge, transmitting places for Indigenous people, the formerly colonized or continuing colonized nations, peoples, and cultural knowledge systems. As Tuck and Yang have showed us, Decolonization is not a metaphor for social justice, though social justice is necessary, not a metaphor for diversity, although diversity is important. It's not a metaphor for critical engagement with history, although history consciousness is needed to be connected to anti-colonialism. And it's not just an additive content to courses and training, but a deep interrogation of how we've come to know what counts as knowledge, who created the processes we are now using, who benefits, and who are the gatekeepers. So in that deep interrogation, we look to how the institution constitutes itself, its curricula, its programming, its methodologies, its theories, its approaches, and as well as recognition of how its riches were gotten, lands taken, disciplines created, intellectuals generated, grammars chosen, and for what purposes, as well as what damage was done. And the notion of how we have to recover and repair the knowledges, the languages, as well as addressing the material gains and lands taken. So that makes this a very much a material, cognitive, and systemic process. Now, I won't go through all of these, but I will share them with you in those of you who want to have this PowerPoint, only to say that Indigenization inclusion has been more of an assimilation approach. In other words, adding people, adding hires, adding courses, adding spaces, adding cultural programming has the effect of putting all of the burden on Indigenous people to be the decolonizing face of institutions. And that cannot do. That reconciliation, education, and institution is where all people now are part of the process for changing education. But that too is not enough, because oftentimes a lot more might be happening at a discursive level. There might be more changes in terms of action, strategic action plans, more Indigenous hires at the senior level, some power sharing with adding a board member or two onto the governance structure. But it really doesn't take into consideration what needs to be done in terms of Indigenous people building their own institutions, and also drawing upon the strength of both the funds and the way to gather and to take their knowledge systems and grow maybe separate systems that can thrive beside other knowledge systems. So decolonization, in my view, is not just the navigating of the ship around the islands, but rather it is about how do we construct knowledge systems that are both in Indigenous languages, similar to French language systems that have their own systems in French and English and Indigenous languages. And there are some growing examples of that around the world. And I know that that can work. So it really builds upon self-determination, the recovery of identities, the recognitions of land and place learning, developing Indigenous sovereignty, and through our reclaiming of our own Indigenous knowledge traditions. It really means that Indigenous scholars, there are many of us who are refusing Eurocentrism and their methodologies and practices, and creating and developing our own theories, our methods, and our own indigegogy, as Stan Wilson and Kathy Absalon have talked about, in terms of indigegogy being different from pedagogy, which pedagogy operates within a hierarchy structure of a teacher and the school board and so on. And indigegogy is what happens in a system that it comes from the land, and also from a more flattened egalitarian approach. We are also asserting the right to teach Indigenous knowledges and practices in our own way, using and appropriate our own ethics and our own standards of practice, and also creating new ways for disseminating our scholarship and knowledge outside of journals and Eurocentric venues and public venues in our own Indigenous languages. And so these require different kinds of actions that might be taken by institutions to understand their complicities, to challenge the racism and Eurocentrism, to bring about social justice and indigenization to all courses and units, develop a recruitment and hire and retention plan for Indigenous hires, to create an anti-racist training of staff, assess the effectiveness of the work culture and current policies, develop a reconciliation action plan and goals and outcomes for every unit, and so on. And so if you look at these kinds of things, I would like to say that, Concordia University, if you go to Concordia University, Decolonizing Indigenous Knowledges and Pedagogies, you will see an active approach done by Donna Goonleaf that is ongoing and takes into consideration all these and much more in terms of the work they're doing, and that it really builds on eco-justice and living well in the interconnections of land and languages, cognitive and social justice, the fair and balancing of education and health, and governing and social systems and professions, holistic lifelong learning, and the building blocks of it from UNDRIP, the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, and to which that will help us to develop the recovery of our lands, our land-based communities, the respect for those Indigenous knowledges and ways of living together, the respect for our spiritual and cyclical renewing traditions and ceremonies, our live-in relation with the ecologies, developing and enhancing resilience from teachings, and advance the resurgence and Indigenous Renaissance. And with that, I'd like to thank you, saying that I think it's important to recognize that nothing about us without us has to be built into the university structures, and that we, as the world of cognitive imperialism, that silence is the shield of domination. Elizabeth Minnick has offered that in the book Transforming Knowledge, and I appreciate this opportunity. Merci, thank you. And here are some of the books that I have published. So with that, I want to then turn this back over to my people. I hope I have gotten in some question time. Could I get something here?
Thank you so much, Dr. Batiste. I really appreciate that talk. I think that was really helpful. My colleague, Nicole Lugosi-Schimpf, and I are going to be running the moderation. She'll be coming up, I'm sure, any second. There she is. I'm going to turn this back to Nicole, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your talk. And I'm sure I speak for everyone here that we are very excited. There's a few very thoughtful questions here. We're also really looking forward to the conversation we're about to have, as well as the various conversations that we'll be having among ourselves and our colleagues near and far for days, weeks, and months to come. I do see some questions in the chat or in the Q&A, but just a reminder for everyone about how this works. Because of the webinar formatting here in Zoom, you won't appear on screen and you are not able to unmute yourself, but we want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions and your thoughts. And so if you pop those into the Q&A button at the bottom, Amanda and I will go back and forth and try to get to as many as we can today. So with that, we'll start with the first question, and it's a big one. The question is, should decolonization and indigenization be a way forward for higher education in lieu of or in conjunction with internationalization?
Well, I think internationalization is still an important element for universities to do. But in internationalization, if you take into consideration UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is an international declaration. It's not yet a convention, but it is definitely has been put into our our Canadian system of laws, to which all universities, all provinces and territories must align now their laws and policies to UNDRIP. The British Columbia has done so already. They have actually adopted UNDRIP and put it into legislation. So I think that UNDRIP, and if you look at all the different elements of it, it is not a new set of rights that are applied in them, but they are the rights that already exist. And when they already exist, as in they're called inherent rights. So Aboriginal rights are inherent rights that already exist. They aren't given by any country. So the recognition in the decolonization of institutions is to recognize that they were created in a time when they ignored all that. So when they go back to looking at internationalization, they must also look to what does the law say now? What is the internationalization laws, as including UNDRIP, and how will that apply in terms of the laws and practices and policies, not just of the universities, but of the professional disciplines as well. So if you go to the 2021 report from Congress of the Federation for the Social Humanities and Social Sciences, you'll find a free document on reserve on the website called Igniting Change, and that report has been sanctioned by and by the Federation, and is given to all the professions and all the associations and all the universities to implement. And there is a charter that everyone can sign individually, as well as universities can sign as them as well. And then there are those things that are each of the recommendations that are being taken up by all of the Federation, which then is the association of all the disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, as well as there is similarity of reports at Tri-Council as well.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I'm going to go to the next question on the list, and I'm just going to read it verbatim because I think it's phrased really interestingly. The question is, I wonder what are the harm that we do when we adopt indigenization from a non-Indigenous inclusion strategy? In your opinion, is there real will to learn from complex and multi-layered Indigenous education without oversimplifying it? What are the traps when we say A should learn from B? And is it performance camouflage? Is it surface surfing? Is it exit fixation? I'm not totally sure I understand those last three phrases, but I do think that the question wording shows that there's some curiosity about how we can do this and well.
Okay. Well, first of all, as my slides we're talking about the elements of indigenization and inclusion indigenization, which has been the primary way in which institutions have taken up indigenization. It's simply an additive form. When it becomes additive, it is largely performative. In other words, the institution doesn't have to change, it just adds people and adds programs and adds what looks like a diverse culture and what looks like a diverse community. When that happens, the institution fails to address the deficiencies that exist still in the institution among their faculty, staff, and students who don't understand what Indigenous is about, or that have no background to it, and are thrusting them into having to feel like they are fearful. They become fearful of change. They become fearful of what they say. They then turn it all over to an Indigenous senior hire than to help them to navigate what needs to be done, and it loses their opportunity to learn. That is why, if you look at, and I've created a kind of a checklist, if not of major things to do at the university level for even Cape Breton University, although they are still yet to, decide whether that is indeed the full agenda of what they want to do, because there are resource implications as well. And so but I was so delighted to see that Concordia University, through the work that's been done by Donna Goodleaf and Manon Tremblay at Concordia, has put online their whole decolonizing strategy. And I just talked to her and sent her an email. I'm waiting for her response on this, is to ask, how much did that cost? And that's always going to be the bottom line. Every university, every unit will say, well, what will it cost for me to educate, to train, to rebuild this knowledge base into our, what we would call our colonial disciplines, our faculty, our staff, our boards, our senates, and all that sort of stuff. What do we have to do? How much would it cost to do that? That's always what they want to know. And no one asked that question when they launched it, but I wrote to her and said, hey, what did that cost? What was the commitment? How much they put forward for that? And are you going to be able to achieve it in the first year or the fifth year? What's the commitment? And so I am now scheduled this afternoon to have a conversation with her about it. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think that is the key, is that it isn't just about, our goodwill. All of us have goodwill. All of us need to learn. Even myself, in my journey was a Eurocentric journey in language and discipline and all of the profession and universities and so on. And it's been a slow grow for me, but I feel like at least I'm halfway there. And the other half for me has to be the language piece. And that's why I'm home, to begin to do that language piece, to really build that and to create an awareness of what is in there that we need to build for ourselves as a self-determination, and how much we share. Because as the point was made, we don't want to share everything, because they'll just take it and reconfigure it in another kind of Eurocentric professional fashion, as many people do. But if we do something together, it might be that we will give up some places and they give up some places, and we begin to do this co-journey. And Edwaptum, co-learning, as in the two-eyed seeing, is a possibility. Now, two-eyed seeing doesn't really have a strong methodological approach, but it does have a provision for us to move together through co-learning, ethical space, cultural interface are some of the other ways in which we understand those particular learning together.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful response. The next question is a definition one. One of our participants is asking how we can understand the concept of self-determination of Indigenous peoples.
Okay, self-determination is understood as what the people need, want, desire, that builds from their own foundational knowledge system, from their own place. It's sort of like seventh generation thinking. If we were thinking from the very beginning, when we do the creation story, we're thinking about the future, and maybe it's not the seventh generation, maybe it's the 14th generation, we're thinking about. But if we have, as a result of colonization, the loss of our lands, the loss of our land-based learning in the community with elders, and all of the survival and that we need as a people on our land that is continuing, how do we continue to pass that on to our own generations 7th generation first and 14th generation included. So that's a long, long time. Is that 500 years, 1,000 years? How long? If we go as presently through colonial losses, we won't have anything. So we are here in this place. We didn't move anywhere except for maybe in the Ice Age, we may have been pushed around a little bit, but we know that our people have been here and that we have a way to survive and live, but at the same time, grow and adapt. So our people need to build that as our foundation for our future. So self-determination begins with Indigenous people defining for themselves their own laws within their own language, within their own knowledge traditions, for how they need to continue to live in place with their environment, with all the relations that come in that environment. And those are all the animals and plants and the water and fire. All of those things need to be considered for the future, as if we are in our own neighborhood and we're going to always live there. There's a world that doesn't believe they are living in home, and they take advantage of their home and they pollute their water as if they can move somewhere else. And the journey into the realms of the moon and the other places is like, is there water there? Is there, what do you think that's about? Is there land? Is there survival? Is there air up there? Can we move up there instead? When this one goes, we see this as our land, and we're going to take care of it. And we're going to continue to build the foundations of our cultural communities and our knowledge systems for the 11th, 12th, 100th generation.
Thank you. I always say that when the time comes that I've got to go live on the moon, I'm just not going. That's it. I'm done. Our next question that I want to go to here, I'm going to read out this paragraph. It's really thoughtful. So the commenter says, perhaps it's not useful to make this comparison, but I'm thinking of the advice of Robin Kelly, who was a historian of Black radicalism. He said that students and professors, I think, cannot change the university, that in our efforts to seek love from these institutions, we'll always be disappointed because they are simply incapable of loving us back. He also mentions that our efforts to seek love from these institutions ends up allowing the institution to individualize demands instead of seeking structural remedies. Instead, he argues, social transformation must happen outside of the university through mass social mobilization. And the questioner asks, do you think this applies to efforts to decolonize the university?
I think it's a really valid, important analysis and point made. I think that it would suggest that we should move our efforts elsewhere and not put them in the institution, except for the fact that the institution has built into it an assumption that only through that process can people be hireable, desirable, and that we need to utilize that system in order to progress. Until we change that assumption, it's difficult to mobilize another movement in another place. But I would say that we need to do these things simultaneously, that there will be people who are visionary activists who will guide us to new and different places. Some of those are already present in the institutions, like the Maori have developed their own educational institutions in New Zealand that are fostering their Maori language as a foundation for learning, and from which they have had, once it became a provincial or a state-funded institution, were contested by the other universities for taking more students than what was thought to be the conventional institutions. And they contested it and said, no, you can be an institution, but you can't take all our students. And so that kind of thing, it demonstrates as possible. And there are other ways that we can develop standards for certification. I would say the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, called WINHEC, WINHEC, is a online organization that is an international Indigenous organization that develops standards for institutions, for programs, for disciplines, for all kinds of things that involve Indigenous people, because they are certifying from Indigenous values, perspectives, and they are a source for all institutions to develop better Indigenous programming. So I think that, we still have those, like the Maritime Higher Education Consortium, or the Maritime Higher Education what is that thing that certification requirements for universities that have to go through that. They need to decolonize, So if we're going to decolonize the institution, we got to decolonize the standards. So it all goes back to the very core, of not just legislation, but also certifications, to addressing language diversities and language accreditation for language learning in languages, getting a high school degree, for example, in Mi'kmaq language. Why not? French does it, and they don't apologize that they don't do it in English. So on. So I think that there's many places to go. It's visionary people that's going to help mobilize us into those places.
Thank you for that. From the questions, from the Q&A box, it's clear that you've been very inspirational, especially for some younger scholars, graduate students, and early career professors. So lumping some of the questions together, one asks the question of being an Indigenous graduate student in a faculty of education, and how that space can be very discouraging and exhausting, always trying to explain their perspective in a very Eurocentric context, with very little Indigenous representation, either in the content or in resources. Their broader question is, what words of advice would you give to a student like themselves, or their professors, or maybe an early career scholar in general?
Well, I say that, one of the things that I have experienced is that all the way through my career. I have been in institutions, Harvard, Stanford, and all that all are Eurocentric institutions, and with people who are very kind, generous, and willing to learn, but are not there yet and haven't had the opportunity to learn from good ways of understanding how to address their own privileges. That is a training in and of itself. It's an education, socialization. It's also training. And so there are some things that we can suggest for the faculty and staff. Unfortunately, in most institutions, it's still in the additive mode, and we aren't going very far. And so a lot of our Indigenous students come in and have to navigate that particular unsafe space, assuming or feeling the tension that every time Indigenous is addressed, that faculty member or will not know how to navigate a discussion around Indigenous prejudices, anti-racism, as well as how to address any of these other kinds of inclusion kinds of things, whether it's LGBT2S kinds of discussions, or whether it has to do with women by themselves, or all those kinds of things. So we're still, each of us, having to navigate that and understanding how to do that in a good way is to feel confident, that you're right, and trust your inner spirit telling you, and be guided by that. Oftentimes, in my work life, I have said things that I don't know where they came from. It came from my heart. And at the same time, they were what was needed at that moment in time. And so I guess it's saying you trust your gut, you trust your guides that are guiding you through your lifetime, through those places. And that as you do that, I think that you will find the right words to help people to get through that. It's trying to contain things like anger and disappointment and frustration in your body as well, as you go through that kind of having to teach people through that. And I guess what I would say is advice, you have to trust yourself to also say it's not all your job to do. It is not, you can only go up to the door of all of where you feel comfortable, and you do not have to take on the world and educate the world to everything. You have to do what's comfortable for you at the moment in time, and let others do the rest of the job. Your job is not to take everybody's role and re-educate them to this, because it's not just one, it's millions. So you just don't have the time or the energy for that. So gift yourself with, I can give it to others to learn on their own. I don't want to take it all on.
Thank you. That's a tough one. I think that's a really common experience for a lot of folks who are being asked to do the brunt of this work, and it's very challenging. I want to ask a question. There's a couple of questions that are sort of similar in here, so I'm going to ask just one of them, and I'm going to remove the other one from the chat. So if your question goes away, this is why. This question, Black scholars in the United States and Canada have advocated for studies of the relationship of Black people to ongoing settler colonial projects that perpetuate Indigenous dispossession. Do you have any suggestions as to how to fulfill this mandate in a manner that reckons with the full weight of settler colonialism while also understanding the specificities of anti-Black violence? Essentially, how can we move forward for thinking about Indigenous perspectives to engage with scholars working to counter anti-Black racism? How can those two things happen together?
Yes, it's an important one, because basically we should never be in a one-up on oppression, as we know that. There's no oppression that is greater. But we've all lived with oppression in multiple forms, no matter who we are. I think that we could identify parts of our lives that have been oppressed. But at the same time, we need to develop allies across our various our journey, and to understand where they make connections. I think that Indigenous and Black have very separate kinds of important elements to it that need to be distinguished and understood, but also there are some parts in which they have been together on. And there's a lot of intermarriage in our communities with Black communities and Black communities with Indigenous communities, but it isn't to appropriate either one of our struggles or to confuse them. It is that they're very distinctive struggles, and we need to add that to our anti-oppressive pedagogies and understandings as well. So, even as Indigenous students, there's a large Indigenous people. We all have so many different things that we didn't know about or don't know about. Probably in my early years, I learned about the women's movement as my first understanding of oppression was to look at women. And I wasn't even looking at Indigenous people at the time, because I somehow became oblivious to the fact that colonialism had hidden all of the oppressions, and I was still holding that somehow Mi'kmaq people because of their backwardness or, whatever, that's why they were not progressing. But it took me to understand women, and then understanding Black civil rights movement issues, and then understanding Indigenous people, that all of it then became clear to me, understanding the whole depth of it. And then thereafter, it was learning to understand other diverse marginalizations and how they are affecting individuals and people within groups. So it's a large area to learn about, and we need to encourage gendered studies, Black studies, Indigenous studies, as formative to our own growth as professionals in whatever field we go into, because you cannot go out in the world and do stupid things or say stupid things. That you've really got to get your ducks somewhat in a row, and those are learning about all these things. So learning about all of it is part of the journey, and it is sometimes it's self-taught and not necessarily all within the academic traditions, because they are not going to give it to you, I'm afraid. If you go into the sciences or go into some of even the social science areas, they are not clear as to how all things fit together.
That's great. The next question is aligned with this idea of getting ducks in a row and taking responsibility for learning. So the question here is, what advice do you have for non-Indigenous allies to not get stuck or frozen by fears, of tokenizing or perpetuating harms?
Well, I guess that's the important first step, is to get yourself understanding your own self-location. Understanding the places where you're in your self-location, you've learned or heard, negative comments about peoples as well as people, and or in terms of how we construct our notions of ourselves related to the environment, to animals and plants. Understand our own social location, our own deficiencies in the education we received, and then begin to think about what do you need to do to overcome any of those fears. I think that a fear is simply a major sign of a weakness that we need to address. Anytime we have a fear, we need to tackle it. And the tackling it means we need to read. There's so much available on YouTube, on Google, and other places, although there's also some false kinds of things there too. We need to be able to critically read what it is that we are getting, and to become informed people for our next generation as we begin to address things like false information and the, at the moment everyone's talking about the AI, artificial intelligence, and the chat GPT. All of that is, coming to be fear. What do we got to do about that? Well, we learn it, we figure out what it is, and then we then know its possibilities and how we might use it, and how it might become another way that we understand the world we live in, both from the negative misinformation that can be put there, as well as the positive. Then it really means that you have to get your heart in the row. It's not the ducks, but the heart. The heart has to be very much in there as well. And intuition is something that's strongly and very importantly a part of how we come to know ourselves. It isn't just a mind body, it's really a mind, body, and spirit. And spirit is very much in each of us. And I think that we're here for a purpose. And sometimes that purpose is going to meet up with a whole lot of adversity. And we just need to learn what are the lessons that we need to learn in our own journey, and how do we navigate those lessons throughout our lifetime. One of the elders that I had once who talked about life as a, she said, if you remember that Robert Frost poem that you go up to the woods and there's these two paths that you can take, and you take the one less trodden or something. In Indigenous thought, we are in this world to journey it, and we have our own path. And when we come to these two rivers kind of path, and it looks like we have to choose one, oftentimes it is we need to take one to learn some lessons that we're going to use on the next path. It doesn't mean that you avoid those lessons. It means that if you took this path down the road, those lessons might be in another path that you take. So it's learning how to navigate a path we're on and learn from it so that we can be better prepared for the next path that we take.
Love that. Thank you. I always teach my students that patriarchy is one of those things that harms everybody. So men, yes, they benefit somewhat from patriarchy, but it also harms them in all kinds of ways. And this mind-body Eurocentric perspective, imagine if we hadn't had centuries of that kind of learning, and if we had thought about, as, victims of colonization ourselves, these other ways of thinking, what our lives could actually be like right now. So it harms us all in that kind of sense. There's a couple of questions that are similar. I'm going to group them together again. And ultimately, these couple of questions come down to thinking about Canada as an example for other places. Is Canada doing things well? Are there lessons that other places could learn from us? It's kind of a tricky question to answer, I think, and so I'm hoping that you can shed some light on this one for us. Through all of Canada's recent efforts towards decolonization, are there things that others can learn from us, or do we have a lot more to learn? Where are we in that kind of world? It's a tough one.
Okay, so lessons learned. I think that one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm writing a book with my husband, and we're doing the update, but also a different book called Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, a Global Responsibility. We wrote the Global Challenge book, and now this is the Global Responsibility. And what we have learned internationally and with people, Indigenous people over the last 40 years, is that we're all on a similar journey and that we are learning from each other. The Canadian example of Indigenous peoples advocating and advocacy for UNDRIP has materialized to a place where it has gone into national legislation. And that didn't come because simply, Canada was so well informed. It was the advocacy. It was the advocacy, the activism, the self-determining Indigenous people who have mobilized that to that place. Canada at present, in the global spirit, has lots farther to go. And I would say it's largely at the institutional levels. That is that's universities, that is professions and disciplinary traditions, whatever they are. But the point of it is that we have made some progress in terms of creating this next step of alignment of laws, policies, and practices to UNDRIP. And like TRC that came out in 2015 and has been a mobilizing force for reconciliation, although we have still far to go for reconciliation to occur. We know it's a long-term process. But sometimes reconciliation gets conflated with indigenization. And people say, well, which one are we doing? Are we doing reconciliation, or we're doing indigenization, or are we doing decolonization? What's the right way that we should be mobilizing ourselves forward? Well, as my talk was demonstrating, each one of them represents some elements that are a little bit alike and different. And so what we need to do is to continue to to clarify the roles and the discourses that are attached to these, and try not to buy into the conservative movements that are mobilizing the anti-trans, the anti-gay lesbian movement, and the mobilizing the anti-indigenous peoples taking their land back or recovering from the land losses and so on. Those are real political strong movements. At the moment, my son is an MP in the Liberal government, and I have, for the first time, got a chance to see the inside of how government works. And I know from that it is a slow process. It's momentous to move a rock, a mountain. But some things can be done by the advocacy within. And some of that has been happening because I have a son who is the only First Nation member in that caucus, and who also lives on a reserve. And so there's a very clear agenda for him, but it's a big job and he needs more people with him to do that work. So it's a matter of, we can't never be complacent. We always have to think about what each of our roles can be as we move things forward. And I think our job is going to get heavier and greater in the years to come. And we just need to stay strong, keep our alliances growing, and teach others what we know, as well as to help our children to navigate that particular difficult time that we're coming ahead.
That's really great. Thank you so much. We have so many amazing questions, but we only have time for one last one. We have someone asking if you would kindly share any story or thoughts that you've had from your own journey through academia that you would consider a success of resilience, navigating the system, overcoming a challenge.
Okay. Yeah. I think that there are many to share. One of the big challenges I've had was getting promoted to professor. I entered the university with multiple publications. And so when I entered into the College of Education, I entered in at an associate level. So I had bypassed the assistant and went to associate. So it was only the one step to professor that I had to navigate after I got tenure. But I was approved by my department level for all the things I had done, but the college itself denied my moving forward. At that time, I had to make a decision whether I would, work harder, and or whether I would fight to the next level, an appeal. And I did, and I appealed it to the next level. And the next level, also the university-wide committee, denied my promotion. At that point, there was only one appeal left, and that was where it was the president's review committee. And again, I had to decide whether I again take this as I have not done enough, or I take it to the appeal level. And my husband, who is a graduate of law school, said, "Of course you take it up, because that's what you have appeal committees for. That's their job to decide whether you have. And when you get to the end, you get to the end." And that was a lesson for me, because I was thinking, well, maybe I should, maybe I don't have, and maybe that I need to. And my colleagues, definitely, are educated people. They know. And of course, I did go through, and I did get the appeal, and the appeal accepted my promotion to full professor. I guess what the lesson learned was, one is that you cannot trust that the system is going to be working on your behalf for you. And you have to be your own advocate, your own person to move things forward. But I had a strong ally in Professor Len Finley, who was an English professor, and he helped me, guided me. And so you need to have a strong, good mentor if you enter into the institution. You need to find a mentor who's going to help you navigate through the institution, these hard places. In so doing, you navigate strong relational foundations with them. We were the best of friends all through his lifetime at the university, and sorry that he just passed. But it is something that I think it's important that every Indigenous faculty member and student find mentors within who will be strong people to guide and you through this system, because it is a minefield of different places where things go awry.
Wow, and what a story of resilience. Thank you for sharing that with us. Unfortunately, I've got to step in here and be the one to cut things off. We're out of time, and not surprisingly, it really feels like time has flown by. We've recorded this lecture, and it will be available on the Gender and Politics Lab website, www.genderandpoliticslab.com, and it's likely to be available also on the Harris Center's website too. Before we go, we would also like to thank the various organizations who funded and made this event possible. This includes Memorial University's Provost, the VP Research Office, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Office of Public Engagement, the Harris Center, the Gender and Politics Lab, and the Departments of Political Science and Religious Studies at Memorial. Lots of folks were really excited to have you here. We'd also like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their financial support. I'm grateful also to Catherine Anderson for joining us and welcoming us this morning on behalf of the university. And I'm really grateful to Kathy Newhook at the Harris Center for helping us set up this Zoom and for all the incredible technical support and behind the scenes hand-holding. I got a lot of hand-holding. I also want to acknowledge the incredible work of our two interpreters, Danica and Heather from Triangular Communications. They really went above and beyond to help us out today, and I look forward to working with them again. And of course, I'd love to thank Dr. Batiste again for making the time to join us today for this incredible, enriching, and really important conversation. I'm so thrilled that you could be here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have a tomorrow conversation.
We do. Top secret. Yes.
Oh.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Indeed.